Nigel, hearing a strange gurgling noise as if a woman was choking, looked away from the window where the bleating could be heard and back at Lily, whose eyes had now rolled into the back of her head as she gargled, apparently choking on something. David looked nervous as if he had just been exposed for a horrendous crime. He began to feel a crippling pain in his chest and put a hand to it in reaction. Nigel looked at Meredith as he began to hear a fast pulse in his head that got slower and slower. Before eventually stopping. All noise, including the wind and the bleating, completely drowned out, and Nigel felt death. He looked back up at David, who was now trying to fight a strange force being thrust upon him as his eyes forcefully rolled up into the back of his head. "Hannah," said Nigel as his hearing returned. "What?" said Hannah as she sniffled through tears. "When I say run, run like a rabbit." Not even 3 seconds later, Nigel gave the signal and grabbed Hannah by the arm, pulling her towards him and knocking the table aside onto the ground in the process. Although they were intent on making a run for it, Nigel and Hannah both stopped in sync with one another when a loud, piercing noise consumed the room, causing a bright green light to shine through the windows that all proceeded to explode into a million pieces. Nigel wrapped his arms around Hannah and held her against him. She wrapped her arms around him in return. The bottles on brackets exploded, spooking the barman and Hunch. The rest of the bottles of spirits, wines and beers all exploded as well seconds later, one by one, like they were being shot at a shooting gallery. The distorted white noise from Hannah's visions could be heard before being overwhelmed by the distorted neighing of the green horse. Nigel looked around and saw Hunch down the last of his Macaro before slamming the glass on the bar so hard it shattered. The hunchback then let out a loud burp before declaring that the evening had only just begun. Hunch's body began to reject the alcohol, causing him to violently vomit greenish-black stout with a slimy texture. The barman's eyes forcefully rolled into the back of his head, and the veins on his neck and head began pulsating due to the pressure. The room began to glow green like outside. Hannah looked as both her and Nigel were now trapped in incredible fear like they'd never known before. They saw Meredith making a run for the door back into the entry hall and followed her with no hesitation. "Meredith, wait!" Nigel cried. Before the couple could successfully escape with the girl, another distorted green horse neigh could be heard, followed by everyone else in the room who was under possession starting to shoot a gaseous green stream of fog out of their mouths. The streams collided on the ceiling and began to form a cloud. Their bodies became thin and withered as they were drained before finally disintegrating. "What is that?" Hannah yelled in fear. "Come on!" Nigel yelled in sheer determination. He ran out of the room as he pulled Hannah along by the hand. Although they made it to the entry hallway unharmed, they were far from safe. Everything seemed normal for all but 2 seconds before Sebastian stopped writing in the ledger and looked up at the couple, instantly adding unease to their situation. Before they had a chance to talk to him, the letters and packages on the shelving units violently flew out as a powerful wind surged the room. The main door and arch doors swung open, followed by the white noise, the distorted horse neighing, and the bright green glow overwhelming the room. Sebastian's eyes rolled back into his head much more willingly than the others, followed by him opening his smiling mouth as wide as possible as he let out an inhumanly monstrous hiss. The gaseous stream of green fog started spewing out of his mouth and forming another cloud on the ceiling. Nigel and Hannah went to run outside the main door, only for the powerful wind to stop them and forcefully blow them out of the arch door. Now vulnerable to the wind and whatever other horrors lurked outside, the couple frantically ran towards the other door. They heard another horse neigh as Nigel desperately tried to open the door. Although it was unlocked, the wind used brute force to pull at the door and keep it shut to prevent Nigel from fully opening it. After a struggle, the door opened from the inside, allowing Nigel and Hannah to stumble forwards. It took further resistance, but the person who helped them get inside managed to force the door shut against the wind, which was suddenly blowing to keep it wide open. After regaining full awareness of their surroundings, the couple realised the person to let them in was Ivan. He was standing by the maid from earlier and both of them looked incredibly distressed, especially Ivan, who was panting, pale, and sweating profusely. "What the hell is going on out there?" he said. "It's that bloody man at the desk, I know it!" cried Nigel. He's in charge of this place, isn't he? He's up to something. Another neigh from the green horse was heard. "Whatever's going on, I haven't got the time for it," said Ivan stubbornly. He turned to the maid. "What is this? What's happening?" I don't know, Mr. Brialt," said the maid. "The horse was acting up earlier, so it might be a bad reaction." "A bad reaction?" Nigel repeated in a shocked tone. "A bad reaction to what?" "I feel like I'm having a bad reaction," Ivan moaned. "My God!" Ivan let out a truly nasty cough. He coughed up some green sludge into his fist. The maid, Nigel, and Hannah looked at Ivan and his unusual phlegm with worry and disgust. The couple knew full well what was about to take place. "Oh dear, not now," said Ivan. "It'll be your turn soon," said the maid. "You two best get out while you still can." Ivan firmly clutched his chest as if he was having a very sudden heart attack before his eyes uncontrollably rolled up into the back of his head. He slowly began to rise as he stood up on his tiptoes. His hands, head, legs, and stomach shook violently as he frothed at the mouth. The maid groaned as her eyes forcefully rolled up into the back of her head. Shortly afterwards, the two of them began to expel the same gaseous fog streams out of their mouths. In a panic, Nigel and Hannah ran around the maid into the sitting room. They dashed straight through it, only to immediately be greeted by the windows exploding and everything in the room being thrown up into the air before crashing down again. The couple managed to very narrowly avoid being hit by anything as they beelined straight into the dining room, where they stopped in shock at a sight that caused Hannah to let out an ear-piercing scream. Not only was everything dusty, decrepit, and covered in a mass of giant cobwebs and mould, but everyone that was in the room when Nigel left was deceased at their tables, grotesquely deformed in some way. The Raynaud couple were bloated to the point their clothes were ripping and their skin was splitting open, with their bloodshot eyeballs ready to pop out of their heads, as well as having their mouths plastered with huge Glaswegian smiles stuffed full of food, implying they were overfed to death. Mary was pale and had a look of shock on her face, with a deep cut into her throat causing her head to be near decapitated, as if it was done with a large meat cleaver or even a handsaw, with her left arm and right hand appearing to have been bitten off by a large beast. And the Nakamuras were mere skeletons covered in cracks and mould, with maggots and worms crawling around their nostrils, jaws and eye sockets. The horse neighing once again obscured Hannah's scream, and the windows in the large mirror above the fireplace exploded, with green glows from outside and on the wall behind the now mirrorless frame illuminating the room. The couple wasted no more time as they ran towards the stairs and up to the second floor. By this point, both of them were perfectly willing to break their legs and arms by throwing themselves outside the upstairs window if that was truly their only means of a deathless escape. As they ran up the stairs, however, reality began to warp. Everything became slow and blurred for the couple as they desperately tried to escape the chaos. Their voices were affected as well, causing them to sound echoed and slow. The two of them reached the top of the stairs and stumbled forward. They barely managed to recover before hitting the ground and returning to normal speed. Caught off guard by the change in speed, they once again stumbled, with Nigel falling face first toward the ground and barely managing to break his fall with his elbows. Hannah kneeled down to comfort him as the nightmarish horse neighing returned amongst the white noise. The upstairs window exploded, with a powerful gust of wind with green light and ghostly fog entered the upper hall, accompanied by the sounds of whispering and hissing. The wind then turned into a suction that forcefully dragged Nigel away by his ankles. Hannah cried out for her partner after losing her grip on his wrists, with Nigel being pinned down just in front of the window by an invisible force. Another horse neigh was followed by a live goat and several torn-up goat body parts being thrown into the hall through the glassless window frame. The goat went crazy and made a run for it, aggressively knocking Hannah to the ground as it barged straight through her in panic. The horse from the barn let out another loud, proud and aggressive neigh, jumping through the window and landing just in front of Nigel. The force pinning him down let loose, allowing him to desperately back away towards the wall behind him as he frantically kicked his legs. The horse glared at Nigel with its glowing green eyes. Nigel and Hannah could only stare at the creature in horror and disbelief. It took a couple of steps closer to Nigel and leaned its head towards him as it stared at him dead in the eyes. Now more confused than anything, Nigel widened his eyes and dropped his jaw at the sight of the horse showing off its teeth before opening its mouth so unnaturally wide it looked as though its head was about to rip in half from the corners of its mouth. Green fog began to pour out of the horse's mouth, followed by gaseous green streams of fog that split off into two and began to form a cloud on the ceiling just above the horse. Hannah looked up at the cloud and saw a spiritual horse-like entity begin to form right before her eyes. From one of the nearby guest rooms, Meredith cracked the door open and watched in horror as the entity began to fully form. She then looked down at Nigel, who helplessly stared back at the entity as it looked down at him. Once it fully formed, it let out a loud, distorted, demonic scream before flinging itself towards Nigel, who was forced against the wall behind him as the spirit entered his body through his mouth. Nigel! Hannah screamed as her partner was taken from her while she watched. Meredith fearfully cowered into a ball and faced away with her eyes shut as she clutched her teddy bear tightly against her chest. Nigel tried desperately to fight the bodily invasion, but it was already too late. The spirit retracted from his body, but it did not leave empty-handed, sucking out Nigel's soul. Not knowing what to do, Hannah desperately looked around, then started to feel inside her own pockets. She pulled out the pocket knife she'd been given earlier. With the largest knife and determination to save her partner, Hannah mustered up all the courage she had left and slowly sneaked up to the horse's physical form. She turned the knife around and firmly gripped it with both hands before shoving it into the horse's neck. The spirit reacted by neighing loudly in pain. It no longer had control over its body, however, allowing Hannah to start carving down its neck. Although she seemed to be winning, the horse spirit neighing was not just a wail of pain, it was a cry for help. Within moments, hands began to break through the floorboards like zombies rising from their rotten graves. Hannah looked down at them to see they were surrounding her. She whimpered and cowardly began to back away, releasing her grip on the knife, which now poked out of the horse's neck like it was a merry-go-round horse. The hands grabbed Hannah by her ankles and held her in place as she desperately tried not to fall over from her loss of balance. Sebastian was one of the undead slaves to the horse spirit, now a deformed, grotesque, zombie-like creature with glowing green eyes, a lipless mouth, patches of hair missing, and his skin an ugly dark olive colour. It broke out from the floor and wrapped its slender, bony arms around Hannah, who screamed and tried to pull away from its grasp as it dragged her to the ground. The unbroken parts of the ground prevented it from fully taking Hannah down with it. This did not help her, however, as the kicking, screaming and flailing did nothing to prevent more of the undead guests breaking out of the ground to smother her. Amongst them was a headless Mary, the bloated Raynaud couple, the skeletal Nakamuras, the relatively well-composed but still rotting maid, the now ghoulishly creepy and grotesque Hunch with a large green boil ready to burst on its exposed hunchback, the ghoulish Downs family, and a surprisingly slender Ivan with half the skin of its face missing. Each undead ghoul had glowing green eyes and green fog leaking from out their mouths. They each grabbed a part of Hannah's body with intentions of either tearing her apart or unspeakably violating her. She continued to scream and struggle against them, only prolonging her impending doom. She leaned her head back and opened her eyes long enough to see the terrified Meredith peering out from behind the door, still crying and whimpering in her curled-up position.
"Meredith! Meredith, please!"
she yelled.
"Look at it! Look at... Meredith, look at it!"
Meredith slowly looked up at the horse and saw that it had been wounded by the relatively small pocket knife.
"It can bleed! Look at... It can bleed! It can bleed! It's weak! Please, just look! It can bleed! If it can bleed, it can die! Kill it, Meredith! Kill it! Kill it! Please! Oh God, help me, please! Meredith, please!"
Although her fear froze her to the bone, Meredith took one last look at her undead family and her friend in suffering. She suddenly became overwhelmed with feelings she had never felt before. Feelings of intense fury, anger, and bravery, combined with the crippling sadness and fear that she had felt for so long. Like an explosive chemistry reaction, she felt a sudden onslaught of pure adrenaline, dropping her teddy and swinging the door open as fast and hard as she could. Despite her small size, Meredith was quick. She ran towards the horse at lightning speed, even shoving Hunch aside as she reached the horse and wrapped her small hands around the switchblade handle. As Hannah further pleaded with the child to kill the horse, Meredith looked down at Nigel, whose eyes glowed green as he simply lay there with the back of his head against the wall in a very uncomfortable position, completely devoid of any life. Meredith's urge to destroy the beast became overwhelming. She began to forcefully pull the knife down. Despite what little strength the girl had, she managed to continue carving the horse's neck open. The ghoulish Torashiro skeleton grabbed Meredith by the hair and pulled on it as hard as its bony hand would allow. Meredith let out a terrible scream in agony as it felt as though her hair was being torn from her scalp. This fueled her to continue to carve into the horse's neck, successfully cutting it open even further. The dissipating spirit of the beast entered a state of intense agony and continued to scream as loud as possible. The ghouls reacted as they began to lose life alongside their controller. Hannah managed to gain an upper hand and began to fight the undead guests off of herself. Once she fully broke their grasp, she dived away from them, landing face first and putting her hands over the back of her head like she was a soldier ducking down from a grenade. Most of the ghouls began to collapse into the abyss they crawled out of. One of them, Meredith's once beautiful mother Lily, managed to cling to life long enough to force herself out of the ground and walk over to her daughter. Not realising her own mother was approaching, Meredith finally sliced through the horse's neck, leaving a large open wound that caused it to profusely leak a gooey green blood. Meredith then pulled the knife out of the horse's thick hide and began to aggressively stab it in the body, only to be interrupted by her mother grabbing her by the wrists and squeezing them with intense aggression. Meredith dropped the knife as she was forcefully spun around to face her mother and screamed at the sight of her. "Bad girl," Lily yelled in a creepy, deep, demonic voice with a very commanding tone. "This place has been so kind to us, and this is how you repay their hospitality! Return to your room!" Meredith pulled away from the corpse of her mother, causing Lily's left arm to break off at the socket. The creature's right hand was still firmly gripping Meredith's arm, so the girl forcefully removed it and asserted her lack of fear to the creature that once controlled her.
"No!"
yelled Meredith.
"You're not my mama!"
Meredith shoved the ghoul backwards, which caused the imitation of her mother to flail about until falling into the hole that Sebastian broke out of. It screamed as it fell into the darkness and disappeared, its screams fading away with it. The left arm, still attached to Meredith, faded away into dust. Meredith reached out for the knife on the ground, but was spooked and let out a shriek after the hunch ghoul smacked her hand away. It looked up at Meredith and snarled at the girl.
"Must all be pleased, Miss Stones."
Hunch laughed sarcastically. Meredith did not let the ghoul get to her and swung a kick directly into its face, breaking its lower jaw off. She quickly grabbed the knife while the ghoul was distracted and continued to frantically stab the horse in blind fury. The spirit continued to growl, neigh, and roar as it was affected by the destruction of its physical body. It looked down at Meredith. She looked up at it in fear, knowing full well what was in store for her. She quickly shoved the knife and her arm into the horse's body as deep as possible. The spirit began to speed towards her, coming close to entering Meredith's mouth the same way it did Nigel. Before it could, Meredith finally shoved the knife into the horse's heart, causing the entity to retract back into its cloud, obscuring its vision to the point it was blinded. Yanking her arm out of the horse's rotting flesh, Meredith fell backwards, landing hard on her palms and bottom. The entity let out one last series of violent, deep, demonic, agonising roars and neighs before exploding into a powerful wind. It caused Meredith and Hannah to be blown away with incredible force. Hannah landed hard in a corner, with Meredith fortunately landing safely in her arms. Warning the girl to hold on, Hannah clutched Meredith tightly against her. The ghoul's broken up body parts began to fly up out of the darkness and all around the hall, with pieces of their flesh hitting Hannah and Meredith. The horse's body eventually dropped lifelessly to the ground, and the wind lessened in strength to the point there was no force to it. although it continued to howl throughout the building. Slowly, ever so slowly, the darkness disappeared, and daylight illuminated the upper hall through the hole in the ground and the smashed open window. Hannah and Meredith remained tucked up in the corner while Hannah continued gripping her as tightly as humanly possible. Eventually, upon hearing birds tweeting and a goat bleating, Hannah cracked an eye open and peeped out to see what was happening. She looked down at Meredith and loosened her grip, but Meredith didn't relent.
Meredith,
Hannah whispered.
Meredith, I think it's over.
Meredith hesitantly opened her eyes and looked up at the hall. She fully perked up at the relieving sight of nothing but the sun shining on the once again decrepit hall. There were no ghoulish body parts, no dead horse, and no green spirit. One thing did remain, however, and it was not a sight either Hannah or Meredith wanted to see. The body of Nigel remained lifeless, sitting against the wall with one knee raised and his arms sprayed out. Hannah helped Meredith up before slowly getting herself up. She put a hand on Meredith's shoulder to comfort the girl. "Stay here, honey," said Hannah. A defeated Hannah slowly walked over to Nigel's corpse as tears began to swell in her eyes. Meredith could only watch with a look of equal sadness and remorse. Despite her young age and barely knowing the man, she couldn't help but feel the immense guilt that came with having led him and Hannah to the inn in the first place, feeling responsibility for his death. She looked over at the door to the room she was hiding in before and walked back into it. Hannah stopped for a second to peer down through the hole in the floor. For some reason, the corpse of Lily Downs lay on the ground. She was no longer ghoulish and her arm was back on, although she was heavily bruised and bleeding from a gash on her head. Her eyes were wide open, her arms and legs spread out. Disturbed by the sight, Hannah continued to walk over to Nigel. She reached the corpse and crouched down to look at her partner more closely, unable to say anything. She put both hands to her mouth as she began to break down crying. A creak in the floorboards spooked her, causing her puffy, red, tear-stricken face to turn and look at the origin of the noise. It was Meredith, who was slightly spooked and took a step back as she continued to tightly clutch her teddy.
"I'm sorry,"
said Meredith. Hannah smiled through her tears and sniffed loudly.
"It's okay,"
said Hannah.
You spooked me."
Hannah closed her eyes for a moment to wipe them with her sleeve. Meredith batted her eyes towards the hole in the ground. She started to step closer out of curiosity. Hannah opened her eyes just in time and her face dropped.
"Don't!"
she yelled. Meredith was startled into not looking down the hole and took a step back.
"Don't look down there, sweetheart. Let's just leave this terrible place."
Hannah reached into Nigel's pockets and recovered the car keys, lighter, and flashlight. She stood up and walked over to Meredith before stopping and looking at the girl in confusion. Her once greenish hazel eyes started to fade to being completely hazel. Hannah felt a strange sensation in her own eyes and put her hand to one of them as she cringed in discomfort. The greenness in her eyes disappeared and they became her natural colour once again.
"We're free,"
said Meredith. Hannah understood but brushed it off, making a choice not to think about what just happened any further. She took Meredith by the hand and led her downstairs. After enduring a slightly chilling, twig-crushing journey through the woods, half expecting to wind up back at the Green Horse Inn, Hannah sighed with relief upon reaching the road. She looked around desperately and eventually spotted the car a little further down. She put Meredith in the passenger seat and shut the door for her. Instead of getting into the driver's seat, Hannah walked to the trunk, opened it, and pulled out one of the gasoline cans. She held it down by her side and closed the trunk. Meredith simply watched Hannah in the rearview mirror as she walked back into the woods towards the inn. Approaching the very same spot where the Green Horse Inn was, Hannah started to look increasingly confused and stopped in her tracks as she reached the opening. She stared ahead in utter bemusement. Where the building, the accompanying barn, and the goat pen once stood was now nothing but a tall, thick, leafy tree with various flowers and other beautiful plants growing around it. It contrasted greatly with the grey skies and mute colour of the woods, creating a warm and earthy feeling in the otherwise completely cold and bleak area. Hannah gasped quietly once she fully processed the sight and dropped the gas-filled can on the ground. She began to shiver before taking a few steps back, turning around and speed-walking back towards the car. After arriving back at the car, Hannah got into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. She turned the key in the ignition. The car struggled at first before finally turning on. She set the car into drive and took off down the road. "Cars don't just break down for no reason," said Hannah. Hannah huffed, trying to find some humour in the situation to avoid going completely insane. Meredith looked out the window at the trees as the car drove on. Although most of them were without leaves and looked half dead, the speed at which they went by offered a calming reassurance that everything would be okay for the time being. Within a local village pub called the Hazel Robin, the friendly, slightly overweight, physically powerful owner in her mid-70s named Eugéne had just opened up. Her nails were painted red, her skin was pale, her hair was grey, she had hazel eyes, and she had a date, 20/10/1931, tattooed on her left arm. She was restocking the spirits shelf, replacing an empty gin bottle with a full one and placing a brandy bottle where an empty spot was. She grabbed a cloth from the side and a nearby pint glass that she began to polish as she turned around to face the front door. As it was the early hours, the old-fashioned, clean and tidy pub was empty. Not a few seconds later, however, the front door was opened rather slowly by Hannah. The barmaid looked up with glee at someone coming in, only for her smile to disappear once she saw the dishevelled Hannah holding little Meredith's hand.
"Good God, ma'am! Are you and the little one all right?"
said the barmaid. Hannah shook her head as she approached the bar, not even bothering to close the door behind her. Meredith was still clutching her teddy tightly against her chest with her free arm. The two of them took a seat on a stool each at the bar.
"A juice for her and something stronger for you, ma'am?"
Hannah nodded. With a concerned look, the barmaid poured Hannah a large 12-year-old Scotch whisky. She grabbed a scooper, opened up an old-fashioned cooler full of large ice balls for rocks glasses, stuck it in the glass, and put it down on the bar. Hannah grabbed the drink and took a hefty swig of it, barely leaving a single shot's worth behind. The barmaid reached into a cabinet full of corked bottles of juices, choosing a bottle of red liquid. She poured some into a tall, thin glass and set it down for Meredith, who put her teddy on the bar and grabbed the glass with both hands, gently sipping the juice with pursed lips.
"Is that cherry cordial and water?"
asked Meredith.
"Why, yes it is,"
said the barmaid with enthusiasm.
It's my favourite." "Well, it's an old favourite of mine as well. I thought you'd like it."
Meredith smiled and drank some more. The barmaid looked down at the teddy and pulled a face.
"Oh, poor thing,"
said the barmaid. She held her hand out.
"May I?"
Meredith nodded 3 times before handing her teddy to the barmaid. The woman tutted a few times at the sight of it.
No, that'll never do."
The barmaid set the bear down on the bar and reached into her apron pocket, bringing out a button and a string attached to a needle. Meredith watched with curiosity while Hannah finished her whiskey with one final gulp and watched in slight confusion. The barmaid proceeded to give the teddy a new eye by sewing the button onto its face. She then began to sew the ripped mouth until it was once again sealed.
"There we are now."
The barmaid put the bear down in a sitting-up position against one of the bar pillars. Meredith took her favourite thing in the whole world and admired it with a large smile plastered over her face.
"Much better, eh?"
Meredith nodded in agreement and cuddled her repaired friend as a small tear began to leak from the corner of her eye. The barmaid reached under the bar to grab something and brought it out before setting it on the bar. A near-identical teddy bear, only it was missing an ear and was much older, being worn and discoloured.
"Mine isn't in such good shape, but it's too late to fix him. We came into the world together, so we might as well leave together."
Meredith stared at the older bear for a second before looking up at the barmaid. She smiled at Meredith, so Meredith smiled back. Hannah was relieved by Meredith's smile and looked at the barmaid.
"Thank you,"
said Hannah.
"Thank you, really. She's been through so much."
"Oh, not at all, ma'am. said the barmaid. "Is there anything you need fixing? Perhaps I could get you settled at the local inn." "That would be nice. What's your name, ma'am?" "Diluane. Diluane Meredith Downs." Hannah didn't clock on for a solid 5 seconds. When she finally did, she pulled her face and took a closer look at the woman with squinted eyes. She had the same hairstyle, the same coloured eyes, and the same distinctly paled skin as the little girl with the same name. "But," said Hannah. But you... "I can look after the girl if you want, ma'am. It isn't easy being an orphan." "How did you know—" "An orphan knows another when she sees one." The barmaid turned to young Meredith. "Would you like to stay here with me, Meredith?" Meredith thought for a moment and looked up at Hannah. Hannah looked back at Meredith in bemusement before looking at the barmaid again. Meredith then looked back at the barmaid and ultimately nodded, effectively cementing her decision to remain in the village. "Perhaps you should stay at the local inn for a couple of days before you go home, Miss Glazer," said the barmaid. "You've earned a good rest. I'll look after the girl. Just tell the owner you're a friend of mine and he shouldn't charge you for your stay." Hannah didn't know what to say. Any possible words she could think of completely left her, as any real grasp she had on what was real or fake went right out the window. She slowly got up off the stool and walked towards the exit, being watched by the two Merediths the whole time. She stopped, turned, and looked at them both. The Merediths both smiled, and the young Meredith gave Hannah a wave. Fighting against her shock, Hannah formed what was barely a smile and just about waved back at the girl. She turned and grabbed the door, ready to close it as she walked out. She was stopped by the elder Meredith calling out to her. Hannah slowly turned to face the two of them one last time. "Thank you for bringing her home," said the barmaid. Hannah did not react for a moment. Eventually, ever so slowly, a smile crawled along her face. She was proud of what she had done, even if it was the result of a holiday she didn't really want and if it had cost her a loved one. Thinking little more of it, she exited the pub and closed the door behind her. Cold grey winters, especially the late winters in November, really get me feeling down sometimes. What lightens my mood though is a good scary story, even though it does freak me out a little bit. I sincerely hope that you've all enjoyed The Green Horse Inn, because I really enjoyed writing it and sharing it with the world. Positive feedback has been incredibly relieving and appreciated. But starting next week on Tuesdays at 9:15, The Photographer and the Car, which is just as scary, just as head-scratching, and hopefully just as thought-dwindling as the last one. It's about a journalist, ex-journalist rather, named Tyler Jones, turned photographer, who becomes fascinated and obsessed with a broken-down, disused mod car on the side of his road, having been set on fire some point during the previous weeks. He's a sad man, and it's a slightly sad story, but I hope you get a smile out of it, or a shiver down your spine. I shall see you next week. Ha 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 ha